Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ethics of AI podcast. I'm your host, Matt Silk, and today we'll be talking about some more exciting topics involving the ethics of AI. Today we're going to be talking about some epistemic concerns that arise when you use AI and some issues that might creep up when it comes to how well we're able to use AI in learning in order to develop our own knowledge and skills. So today I have Dr. David Hildebrand. He's a professor of philosophy from the University of Colorado, Denver. David specializes in American philosophy and the philosophy of media and technology. And in a relatively short period of time, he's going to be presenting at a conference about the dialogue in democratic education at the University of Oulu. And so we'll be talking about the argument in the paper that he has developed for that conference. David, welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great to talk with you.
So, like I said, you're going to be presenting this argument at the University of Oulu soon. So I was wondering if you might just sort of explain to our listeners what your argument will be and what your major concerns are involving AI.
Yeah, so I'm mainly concerned with whether or not new technologies are preserving or allowing us to preserve our autonomy when we inquire into questions. If we could be inquiring into questions of facts or values or even into creative projects. So I think that autonomy is valuable because the process of becoming a person, becoming a self, means that we're not being pressured, right? Being pressured temporally or in other coercive ways. We're not being manipulated to reach outcomes that we might not have gotten to if we had just done it on our own. So this concern with technology and concern with autonomy go hand in hand. And so this is the sort of general question I'm going to be looking at in my upcoming talks. I think the way I'm breaking down this question of technologies interactions with us is I see technology as intervening in our lives in sort of three basic ways. The first way is surveillance, right? It not only surveillance in the sense of cameras or microphones, but also the way that websites and other technologies track us, collect our data, and then tailors the algorithms that attract us to them and make us want to use them, or maybe summarize who we are to other people. So the first is surveillance. The second way that technology intervenes is nudging and hyper-nudging. And so these are ways in which our choices are being shaped and guided in an online environment. So this could be an invisible way, such as the way we're sort of led through a website to reach a certain outcome or to click on this, or even things like pop-up ads and so forth. But these sorts of invisible nudges that we can't see when we're online are important because they happen beneath our attention, right? Beneath our ability to endorse their interference, but they direct us about who we're going to relate to. Like on social media, they put certain people in our feed and hide others, or they might influence what we buy, what we watch, what we listen to, and even what we learn. So that's the second. So surveillance was the first, nudging is the second, and the third way in which technology sort of intervenes in our lives is through articulation. And I think of articulation as being the main strength and perhaps the main potential danger of large language models like ChatGPT and Claude. And so when I think of articulation in large language models, I'm thinking not only of the way that they can answer our questions, but they can explain things, they can brainstorm with us, they can outline, imagine, and even write for us what they assume that we want to say. And so this is a challenge or a potential danger because a very powerful large language model like ChatGPT or Claude can preempt us before we've had a chance even to struggle with ourselves about what we want to say. So at any rate, that's sort of the larger sketch of my concerns in the arguments I'm making in my talks.
In your paper, and perhaps this is like slight inside baseball in terms of philosophy, but you focus on this idea of when humans inquire, they kind of need this kind of incoherent sense of indeterminateness, right? That when humans inquiry, when humans engage in an inquiry, they have to sort of figure things out that are sort of murky, right? And AI kind of preempts this to some extent. I was just wondering if you might be able to say a little bit more about this aspect of inquiry and why you think it's important.
I think, the best way to start answering that question is just to think about what it's like to interact with a small child. And you might just be asking them, how was your day at school, or what do you like to do for fun? And it's very important. You'll see, if you ask a small child a question, you will see them pause and sort of start processing what they want to say. You can see them kind of struggling to figure out what to say back to you, how to answer your question, how to represent themselves to you. And, mature adults will let a child sort of think on their own and think about what it is they want to say and how. And you don't want to sort of jump in there and help them finish their sentence or even suggest things to them, because something very precious is going on. They're searching in their minds or in their imaginations for something which it's not quite formed yet. That's why I'm using the word inchoate. It's not that it's mystical, it's that it's not yet congealed and come together. And that process of calling asking yourself these questions and then diving into that uncongealed, that inchoate feeling is a huge part of what it means to answer a question, and a huge part of why we take ownership and feel like that was my answer, that was my idea. And so the concern about AI is that when AI jumps in very quickly and starts to process and answer the question, often very grammatically and very sort of appearing to be intelligent, there is a way in which that just stops us from doing any struggle with the inchoate. So the same thing that happens with adults when they're asked a tough question is what happens with a child when you ask them what they did in school that day. It is a kind of struggle that involves memory, feelings, and something which is just not formed yet, the inchoate. And I think intervening in that early stage is almost like taking their answer away from them before they've had a chance to form it.
It's really interesting because, the fact that AI can produce answers so quickly and efficiently and so sort of smoothly, it doesn't take time to ponder, it doesn't take time to consider things. I wonder if this is also part and parcel of what feeds the idea of automation bias as well. That when people see a sort of nice, clean answer being generated, very quickly and smoothly, it's almost becomes easier to kind of turn your brain off and not really focus on things that might be murky because you just have the answer kind of given to you. So I wonder if maybe do you feel like that maybe also feeds automation bias?
Automation bias meaning our tendency to give in to automation.
Yeah, and to defer, like if an AI generates an answer very quickly, we might say, oh well, we almost mistake that for kind of confidence in a way.
Yeah, I think it does feed that automation bias for sure. The There's always an anxiety, even a small one, that we face when we're answering a question. And when we look at an answer that seems good enough, I think part of our brain just wants to be relieved of the anxiety of trying to come up with something else. And so I think there is a tendency, and I feel this too when I play around with large language models and I see that it's phrased an answer for me more or less as I would have said it. I can sort of convince myself that's how I would have said it. And so just I accept that kind of automation. I think it's important to distinguish that some situations are important and other situations are more routine. If I'm getting an email from a company that I purchased something from, and they're saying, I'm sorry, but you're out of warranty. And I already know that my email is going to ask them, why am I out of warranty? What can I do to get a refund on this, or whatever it is? That is a very routine task that I would be happy to see an automatic response to, that I could then look over. I don't feel like I'm calling on my inchoate imagination to formulate a fairly routine question like that. So I think there are literally uncountable types of circumstances where we're drawing upon feelings and thoughts, and some of them are very routine and some of them are not. And so there's a kind of challenge for us to figure out, what is the circumstance that I'm in, what kind of question I'm being asked. Will I become somebody different if I sort of search my own inchoate, my own feelings, memories, and thoughts and imagination to answer it? Or is this like using a calculator to calculate how much tip I need to leave on a restaurant check?
Well, I find that kind of interesting, and that I think that kind of leads to my second question, right? So you expressed this concern that AI can sort of undermine our ability to sort of think and learn for ourselves. But as you mentioned, right, that not every circumstance are we equally as interested in focusing on, excuse me, those elements of our inchoate experience and trying to work those things out. Where do you sort of really see the sort of problem creeping in? Because there might be some circumstances where we're kind of very happy to defer to AI, because that's kind of the point, right? We don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about things or working through certain kinds of issues. But there might be some areas where we do care much more about that. So how do we sort of deal with the sort of balance between those different kinds of contexts? Should we be equally as concerned in every context, or are there some contexts where we should be more satisfied to sort of defer to AI, and other areas where we should be more concerned about not deferring to AI?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we have a situation of ambiguity as to when and whether we should use help to answer a question, or an assignment or a project or something like that. And it seems a little burdensome to ask oneself of every question one faces, who will I be if I have the machine do the task for me? So I think the challenge is one way of thinking about the challenge is to think of limit cases. So limit cases where maybe it would feel wrong to use AI or to use automation. So I'll give you a few limit cases. So imagine somebody who uses ChatGPT secretly, like maybe on their phone, when they're in a confessional at a church and they're talking to a priest, right? Or imagine someone who's using Claude to answer interview questions during a job interview. Or imagine someone who's using another large language model, Gemini, just to give equal time to the different major models, to write their wedding vows, right? All of these are uses which seem to hollow out these sorts of important moments in a person's life. And these are moments where they're being called to sort of rise to the moment and express what they really believe, or they feel, or they agree to promise. So it's hard to sort of come up with a rule about when is something a limit case and when is it not. But in some ways, this is the natural problem with all ethical dilemmas. When does something move from being just etiquette and becomes ethical? And this, in some ways, is a case of phronesis, I think.
Do you think that perhaps so like there might be some cases again where we might be happy to defer, and other cases where we wouldn't? But do you worry that there might be, like in the cases where we are happier to defer, when we do, that can undermine our own ability to think in the cases where it does matter? So it's not just a sort of where do we draw the line kind of thing, but does it become a sort of systematic problem where even when we defer to AI, when we don't care as much, it still becomes a sort of larger problem in those cases when we do care?
I think that's right. I think what you seem to be pointing to, at least as I interpret your statement, is when does something which seems like an innocuous habit become a habit which changes who we are? I think these kinds of dilemmas they're sort of insidious because, in real life, the intrusion of machines and automation, it doesn't happen like it does in the movies, like 1984 or The Prisoner or The Matrix, right? We never really directly feel the boot on our neck. Often we'll say these are just tools and all these things are up to us. But I think anyone who's tried to sort of quit an addiction knows that you can acquire a new habit without really understanding the power and the scope of that habit. And so we might suddenly find ourselves at the bottom of a bag of chips or scrolling social media for an hour rather than just 10 minutes. Or we might find ourselves habitually using AI to sort of keep us productive or sort of on time with our tasks. So I take it that in your question, there's a way in which routine or nearly routine uses of AI could become the kind of habit which only after a while would we realize that we got used to it, and it's now sort of changing how we think or maybe who we are in sort of a larger, more existential sense.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of stretch that kind of question, I think, in different ways. Everything from like, how would I articulate a certain idea or something like that to even something like my spelling skills, right? If I, most of the time don't really care to check my spelling and I'm happy to let my computer do it for me. There might be other occasions where I just suddenly discover that not only maybe perhaps I don't really have great spelling skills without the AI, but I also may be poor in terms of being able to articulate my own phrasing or articulation of a certain idea or concept because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember early on when computers came on the scene and people started using spell checkers and even thesauri, that I had friends who didn't want to use a thesaurus that was online, not only because it offered a limited number of words, but it also would sort of stop them from trying to think of words themselves. It's almost like a musician that only knows how to play in a couple of different keys. Well, all of a sudden you're in a circumstance where you need to play it in a key that you're not familiar with, and you don't have the facility. So there are all these different devices and automations in our lives that make us less self-reliant. But in the case of AI that you're pointing at, it may actually constrain and limit our imaginative capacities. And I'm not sure whether there's anything more important to being a person than the imagination that we can call upon and inhabit. And if some of these AI habits start to chip away at that, we may find that we've really become something less than what we wanted to be.
What you said was kind of funny. I was talking to someone the other day, and we were both kind of at one point talking about how oftentimes even using AI, we just sort of use it as a sort of glorified thesaurus. So it's sort of funny that over a decade later, it's like these are still the same problems.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't really have anything too much against the thesauri, but the again, it's just having to check in with yourself about what is this doing to me. You almost have to always be a bit metacognitive, a bit aware of how your thinking is going. And people get late when they get older, and they start to get into their 60s, 70s, and so forth. There's all of this literature about how you should do puzzles every day and keep challenging your brain, and that's good for you. So I'm not sure why those lessons about avoiding some of the pitfalls of senescence would not apply to people who are younger and want to have the fullest possible capacities that they could have.
One of the ways, and we've already talked about this a little bit, but one of the ways that AI can interrupt our processes of inquiry is through the use of nudging. Now, for those who are unaware, nudging involves structuring a choice in a way to make a certain outcome easier or more appealing without actually sort of restricting the choice itself. So, for example, setting up something like a default option. So, what are the biggest concerns that you have in terms of how AI nudging might affect judgment?
So I guess, one of my general concerns about nudging is how often we're nudged. And this could be in very small and very subtle ways. So this is a tricky part of living in a convenience-oriented culture, in a device paradigm, as Albert Borgman put it. So we get used to being nudged and we start to expect it. So we live to be nudged. So a good example of this is the smartphone map. I love mine and I wouldn't want to give it up. But when I go somewhere, I am submitting to about 100 nudges or so. Just make a right, get in the left lane. And you might say, well, is it helpful? And I think often it is. But my overall way of getting places has changed. I'm not really an agent or a navigator anymore. I'm more like the thing that gets navigated. I'm like a cargo container that winds up at the right loading dock. So if I say this is now my automatic habit, I guess I'm effectively saying that I've ceded my agency to nudging. And the question then becomes, have I changed by doing that? And this is hard to say because we're only living the life we're living. And the best we can do is kind of reflect on what it was like before or what it would be like to go without. So to answer your question, nudging in this case, right, and others that are like it, involving all kinds of other choices, can affect judgment by making me a little bit less certain about what I would have chosen without the nudging, and a bit less certain that I still have the fullest possible capacity to choose all by myself.
That's interesting because again, the map analogy is really interesting one because, not that long ago, it was like if you were getting map directions from the computer, you were printing out MapQuest, right?
Yeah.
And then before that, you were literally reading a map. And I suppose that could become a particular problem if you begin to sort of lack the ability to use a map, right? Again, if your GPS goes out and your phone dies, right? And you have to use a good old fashioned map and navigate your way around. Could you do that, right? I suppose I think one of the sort of questions about sort of skills and our ability to sort of think for ourselves is also the general notion of adaptability, right? Can you adapt to different kinds of circumstances, and what kinds of circumstances should you reasonably be expected to be able to adapt to?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's something else that's at stake, which which I'm pulling out of your question, so maybe you can elaborate on it too, which is that when, let's say you're in a new city and you want to find this place you need to get to, and you pull out, let's say, a physical map. By looking for that place on the map, your eye scans over many other places, and you get a sense both for the trees and the forest. And this is, in a way, you might say that's a sort of an external byproduct of using physical maps. But what you're doing is you're grasping the bigger picture while you look for the smaller destination, and that turns out to be useful maybe for this journey, but certainly for the days you're going to spend in that city, because your eye has taken in other neighborhoods, nearby destinations. It is noticed a lot just as you were looking for that first thing. So one of the things that nudging technology does is it really creates a kind of myopia on very specific goals. And then it makes us, in a way, kind of sort of instruments in getting to that goal. And that's, if our purpose is really narrow, that's all we want. It's a huge time saver. But if you're doing things like exploring a city, or you're trying to get the lay of the land, and we have all these expressions for this, the nudging technologies that we currently have are so specific that they tend to disburden us of getting the lay of the land, getting a sense of a place, getting a feel for a place. All those kinds of expressions are now made unnecessary, or they're obviated by the technology that we're using.
That's really interesting because it's it really tells you that it's not even just an AI issue, right? Like even a map, even just a paper map can essentially nudge you, right?
Right.
So it's not like it's a huge technology thing. It's just that map making is also kind of technology, and yeah, so like when you make technology in a certain way to accomplish certain tasks, it does kind of narrow, I guess, your potential experiential possibilities.
Totally. Exactly. I mean, this is they psychologists study this all the time with children. Children who walk on natural ground and on stones get a much better sense of balance earlier than children who walk on very flat and machine surfaces like concrete and wood floors and houses and so forth. And so we're always learning, even some of it is not directly on task.
So I think this kind of ties in with my next question, which is sort of part of a broader sort of I guess sort of ongoing question I have when considering ethics of AI issues, where the question is this a new issue? Is it really AI that's making a difference? And how would we think about these kinds of issues in other cases where we're not using AI, right? So again, even something like a paper map can be a form of nudging. But you discuss how AI is different from other kinds of technology because it's more interactive and instantaneous. However, the concerns you raise about AI interrupting our ability to articulate our thoughts and ideas, and the risk that we might sort of become dependent upon LLMs for thinking. But I'm kind of curious whether this concern could potentially apply to other people, right? So if you never used AI, but you were the kind of a collaborative person, does the same concern potentially arise where if you collaborate too much with other humans, it could also diminish your capacity for knowledge production and your ability to have epistemic independence?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the concerns are similar for sure. I mean, we live in the world with other people, and a lot of them have something to say or a reason to sort of dominate a conversation. So, we've all found ourselves trying to get a word in or feeling as if someone else was speaking for us or without our full consent, or maybe even feeling as if someone else is steering the conversation. And so I think one difference that's important with human beings versus machines is that we're in a social situation with them. And we may even be in a relationship with them that's going to last longer than the conversation that we're having. So those factors give us additional leverage to kind of push back and assert our point of view with other people sometimes. But the thing about LLMs that's really different is that they're designed to please us. And they're also designed to use things that we've already said in the way that we've said it to sort of fill in and make suggestions for us. So the LLM, the AI, large language models, and other sorts of technologies can use a lot of data based on what it's already gathered to suggest words and phrases and ideas. And that could be really seductive and hard to resist. And it's not something that other people typically do, even when they're not trying to dominate us, but just help us. So to me, that's the big difference, is that AIs are not only faster, but they want to please, and they use data that's based on our own inputs in order to intervene with us in a much more sort of seductive and informed way.
What lessons can we learn in terms of how we might develop AI in ways that might be more conducive to inquiry? Would there be a better way to potentially develop AI that might be more confrontational and less definitive, right? So, for example, if you ask it for a particular question, it might give you several answers as opposed to just one in order to help encourage your own critical assessment and decision making rather than just sort of passively relying on it. Is there ways that we could perhaps develop technology that would actually improve those things?
Yeah, I think there are, the literature is expanding way faster than I can keep track of it. But I think there's, some interesting work being done on how to make maybe AIs a little bit less eager to please, a little less, you know, inclined to supply us with our own words. There's a researcher at King's College London named Sylvie Delacroix, and I read an article by her called Designing with Uncertainty, LLM Interfaces as Transitional Spaces for Democratic Revival. So, she's proposing in this piece a way for designing large language models that don't provide overconfident answers. And so this can help sort of keep some of the uncertainty that are part of our human conversations, right? Ones where we're deciding things together. So as I understand her proposal, at least, we might have multiple models of large language models that are trained on different data sets, not all on the same data set. And more important, they'd be open designs for different communities of people to experiment with. So you might have very different communities of people with very different ideas about what they want to get out of an interaction or partnering with an AI. And they could both supply it with a different data set, but also see how the AI is processing that so that it doesn't come out always with the same kind of confident, affirming the user kind of answer. So, this is important from a democratic standpoint because, if AIs and large language models are going to be partners in thinking about problems, we may not want large language models to very quickly supply us with answers. We may want it to ask us questions, challenge our answers, or just provoke us in a friendly and civil way to raise questions for conversations with each other and sort of think of it as integrating and facilitating dialogues between people. So we always have this model in our mind of me and the computer, me and the large language model. But a large language model could also be like a facilitator in a group that needs to think through a problem together. And that's a much less controversial kind of use of the technology, especially if they have access to the data sets it's using and the designs with which its algorithms are processing their inputs.
Kind of interesting. I think this ties into a couple questions I kind of have. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but the University of California, Berkeley Law School recently announced a sort of new school-wide policy that was very, kind of really cracks down on AI, right? So you're not allowed to use it for anything from conceptualizing, outlining, drafting, revising, translating, or editing any work submitted for credit. So given some of the concerns that you're raising, do you think that attitude makes sense in education? Do you think that there are some more practical lessons that we might take away from your argument? So, for example, like I think you just mentioned the idea, like if you're using AI or LLMs as part of a group activity, for example. But are there other kinds of ways that we might be able to sort of effectively make better use of AI? So, for example, like I'm envisioning the idea of like documenting our own goals and intentions and ideas beforehand before we use AI to start nudging us in certain directions rather than other ones.
Yeah, I think there are probably a lot of ways to use the current AI in ways that don't sort of prevent us from developing good critical or imaginative thinking. So I'm not sure what the University of California, Berkeley Law School has got in mind, or what they think their students are going to gain by having this kind of fairly drastic ban. But I think that keeping goals in mind is a good way to keep the AI's contributions in perspective, and it's a good way to sustain a balance of us actively making connections and coming up with new ideas when we're faced with this rapid output of, say, a ChatGPT or a large language model. I think this is something that everyone has to learn how to monitor. So the outputs of these large language models come very quickly. They're often very good. And so I might start asking an LLM for help with a goal that I have in mind, and then maybe have a bunch of ideas and feelings that cohere loosely around that goal. The question then becomes is when an AI starts answering very quickly all these sorts of well-phrased and logically ordered suggestions, I need to figure out what to do with my habit of saying, oh, that's a really good answer. That's better than what I was thinking. I'll use that. So I think that, just going back to your question, is there a way to either use these tools or design these tools so that they sharpen our critical thinking and our imaginations rather than dulling them or de-skilling them? I think the answer is yes, but it seems to point back to there being more, I mean, I hate to use the dirty word in a podcast, but using more epistemology in the basic training of students and learners with AI. They have to understand that what they're engaging in is a process of thinking about thinking as well as thinking about the problem in front of them. And it's only if they have some sort of greater preparation about thinking will they be able to monitor when AI is being helpful and when it's sort of robbing them of maybe time spent with themselves struggling in a creative and productive way.
I think this kind of goes back to that question about the fact that, a lot of large language models aren't really designed for education in mind, but it's easy to envision ways they could be designed that actually could be very helpful. And like you said, like the ability, sometimes AI can be problematic if it's nudging you or if there are various biases in the training data and stuff like that. But I was talking to someone else earlier, and to some extent, it's also a bit like the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. It's a bit like polling the audience, and sometimes there's value in polling the audience. Sometimes the audience doesn't know what it's talking about, but at least polling the audience can also help get you out of your own head, right? So there's
Right.
some value in being able to at least check your assumptions and guesses against a kind of statistical norm.
That's right. And we are all stuck in our own ruts as well. And so the challenge of figuring out how to get out of your own head and to sort of shake things up is an old one. I'm reminded of something which I think I'm trying to remember that Brian Eno and maybe Peter Schwelm, I can't remember the other author, but they created a deck of cards called oblique strategies. And these read like almost like fortune cookie fortunes, things like, go look outside or think of doing the opposite, or they're very kind of enigmatic, like Cohen, but they created this deck of cards. You can find them on the internet now. And they were all meant to be ways of helping you break out of your own thinking and or at least divert your thinking towards something new. And there's no reason that a large language model couldn't do something like this as well. But I think it has to be programmed carefully, and it has to be programmed with at least machine incentives that are not to keep us engaged, to make the app sticky, to sort of drive us towards an end goal and please us in those sort of traditional productivity ways.
Yeah, give us more training data.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, that's the funny thing is like I said, I could envision a lot of potential really valuable ways in which AI could make real contributions, but the technology would have to be designed and set up in such a way to help facilitate that. I mean, even again, talking about first year students writing their first philosophy paper, I mean, a basic question, right? Is what I've written coherent? Does it make sense to another person on a very basic level? And, sometimes, beginner students, kind of struggle with this because it always makes sense to them. But literally just being able to ask another person, quote unquote, does this make sense? There can be a lot of value to that.
Yeah. And sometimes, sometimes they call this say back, right? In writing, like just say back to me what you've just heard me say in your own words. And this is enormously revealing because our perception of what we meant and what someone else's can diverge. And now there's a kind of social tension which needs to be resolved. And we don't feel that as much with machines, right? Machines may just, we don't care. They have no stakes. So we don't care if they misunderstand us.
But I mean, yeah, but there can be a lot of insight to how it understands this or how someone else understands this. I mean, even for my purposes, sometimes I might enter in a sentence and say, well, how can I make this more concise, or how can I, do this, that, and the other? And rarely would I ever like just completely defer to it. But I mean, there is valuable and sometimes just seeing other ways that your own words can be phrased, right? Like there's room for learning opportunities, I think, to actually sort of critically evaluate your own work and kind of say, well, do I, maybe I am long-winded, right? Maybe I can like learn from this, like general ways I can be more concise, or phrase my own thoughts in ways that are not so, long and overbearing.
No, that's right. And I think, really good feedback takes a lot of time and effort on the part of, the other person. And I have definitely found there are large language models like Claude, where if I give it some text that I've written and ask it for 3 different reactions, it will definitely make me think about the way I put things, and I'll notice, like, oh yeah, I can see why I was being sort of long-winded in that passage. That was because I was just getting the ideas out of my head, but it noticed, and now I can see that trimming it back will just make it much more listenable for the other, when there is a real person listening. So I think of AI as being a tremendously powerful partner, but the prompts have to be there have to be good prompts, and you have to have some metacognitive or some sort of planned reason as to how it's going to help you before you start using it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it definitely seems like, and again, talking to someone earlier about the importance of developing AI literacy is an important thing. But even just beyond, something like that, just careful, critical thought about what you're doing and what you're trying to get out of it, and where it might be leading you in the future are all really, really important questions to ask yourself.
Yeah, and this is when someone asks me about AI or large language models, and they're like, "Well, I just don't use them because I just have no idea how to use them or what to do with them." One of my standard answers to that person is now, why don't you ask the large language model how to use it? And you can ask a large language model, what are some ways that I can be critical about my own writing process as I get going on my first philosophy paper? And it will give you some ideas. And you can always check those with a teacher or a TA and for feedback. But that's the thing, is you can ask a large language model what it's good for and see what it says, right? It's it will give you an answer.
Yeah, and it's kind of like what you said. It's you can kind of think about AI as being a kind of partner along the way. If you're careful with it and discerning about how you use it, it can actually be a valuable resource in that way.
Yeah, that's right. And it's just hard, I think, sometimes for if you don't know the subject matter, if you don't know how to write a paper, or you don't know the philosopher or whatever subject matter that you're studying, you can easily get misled about a good method to use or whether or not the information is accurate. And so everything that's spit out by a large language model is organized, it's grammatical, and it sounds plausible. So if you don't have much knowledge about the method or the subject matter you're researching, you will incline towards thinking that the large language model gave you a good answer. But that is a mistake, because it's a probability generator. It's not veridical.
Yeah. So I think we should probably wrap it up there. This has been
Okay.
an interesting conversation about education and AI, and I'm sure there'd probably be people at home who would be happy to hear more from us. But there's only so much time in the day. But David, I want to thank you for joining me today for this episode.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Hopefully, we might be able to have you back for future episodes as we talk about more potential issues. I'm always happy to hear from lots of different people about this topic. I mean, the interesting thing about AI is that it tends to make everything old new again, and so it always attracts people who are happy to talk about these issues and rethink things from scratch. And do our old assumptions make any sense anymore?
Yeah, I think this is a conversation worth having.
So this has been another episode of the Ethics of AI podcast. Joining me today was David Hildebrand, professor of philosophy from the University of Colorado, Denver. Dave, I want to thank you again for joining me.
Thank you so much.
This has been another episode of the Ethics of AI podcast. I'm Matt Silk, and I will catch you in the next one.